Hi, I'm Christoph van Tomme, and I come to talk to you about artificial intelligence. And I know that might sound like sci-fi, but I hope that in these 5 minutes or less, I'm going to convince you that this is not sci-fi and that you should honestly be thinking about artificial intelligence and how it will affect your documentation. To start my story, once upon a time, there was this thing, the manual. And the manual was everything, it was God. It came, like when products, even software products, still came in boxes, they had these beautifully well-crafted pieces of documentation that people had been thinking and mulling over to make a beautiful deliverable. But today that's kind of like changing, and I'm sure that you've seen in a lot of products, like documentation is kind of creeping and fragmenting and becoming part of more and more of the products. And it's kind of like with microcopy, you see that it's splitting apart. Now, I think this is just a start. I think it's going to get way, way more like that. And I base that on one of, well, amongst others, on this book by Kevin Kelly, which you should really read. It's really interesting. In which he, amongst others, talks about flowing and how the information is going from self-contained like deliverables, like pieces of documentation, documents, manuals, to pages, to flows, how everything is becoming this flow of information rather than like a self-contained unit. And I think that this is going to get even more so once we start using AI in documentation. I think that with AI we can do really crazy things with flow. For example, you could have a chatbot that answers you whenever you have a question and that knows what the context is that you're in. I believe, and now little dramatic pause, I believe that Clippy is about to make a comeback. Now, it's getting worse. I believe that he's going to be a lot smarter. He's going to know where you live, who you are, what you know, what you don't know, and I believe that actually that might be a good thing. To find out why, go and read my blog post series that I wrote about this, and or better yet, sign up for the mailing list, and or come to the Unconference right after this session slot at 2:25, just across the room, across the corridor in the other room. Okay, thank you very much.
So, I'm Laura.
And I'm Kathleen.
And this is a funny thing because Kathleen is from Flanders and she lives in Hungary. And I'm Hungarian and I live in Flanders, actually almost in the next village. And we work at the same company. Yeah. Remotely, both of us.
Yes. In fact, we're combining different jobs.
Because yeah, we're trying to be technical writers and we're faking it right now. And we are also moms of small children, which is also a job.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we would like to hold an Unconference, and this is like a quick intro for talking about tips, tricks, hacks on how to work from home. What does it mean like being isolated, procrastinating like a pro, and being demotivated, and how to hack that yourself, alone.
Yeah. So in short, how to work from home and how to make that work. We'll hold an Unconference at 2:15 at table 4, and please join us if you're interested. Thank you.
See you.
Obviously, all of you know Write the Dogs, right? Yeah, otherwise you weren't here. Lots of you also know Read the Dogs, right? Who knows Read the Dogs? Cool. And we thought we have to follow this path because we have reading and writing, but we are missing testing. So the whole idea from Test the Dogs is, well, obviously all about testing. And first of all, I want to apologize for the really bad logo, but I suck at design. But Chris just got volunteered to create a new logo. And the thing is, where I come from, I'm a developer from background, so we never did this whole technical writing thingy. And like developers, we thought we need an automated way to test our docs. First, basic stuff like wording, syntax check, link check, and so on and so on. And so we started to write automatic tests for it and test framework and whatever. And now we also find out that's cool, but we also have to make sure that people actually understand our docs. That's also why we came up with HIT, what's standing for us for user interface testing, meaning we take a real human and ask him to test our docs. And the whole idea from Test Docs is to create a platform to share lots of different ways of how you can test documentation, how you can integrate tests into your CI workflow. If you have a cool Sublime setting for your editor to test docs, if you have another cool tool chain, whatever, share it. It will be it's on GitHub. Documentation, all the stuff will be online, I think in November, because in October we're basically off to the States to give training at the MIT about learning, testing, documentation, and blah, blah, blah. And there will be, this is a cool thing, there will be an Unconf in 2017. And the whole idea is to integrate it with the next White Docs Europe. So we still have to think how we do that. But yeah, if you're working with documentation and you're keen about testing your documentation, if you like to learn to test it in an automated way, or if you have already a cool setup, let us know, sign up for the mailing list, come to the Unconf, send us a pull request on GitHub to extend the docs, and that was all.
So, what do you do? It's what you're inevitably asked when you're meeting a new person. What I used to say was, I'm a documentarian, I read documentation. And the look on their face is usually, oh, I'm sorry. It sounded like the most boring job in the world. And I sometimes struggle to explain to people what is it that I'm actually doing. And I was thinking that using some metaphors might help. And I'd like to share some of those metaphors with you. My name is Milan Navratil, and I work as a technical writer for Red Hat, where I write Red Hat Enterprise Linux documentation, specializing in performance tuning and storage configuration. So at first I thought, well, I work with Linux, I can say something like, I'm a penguin tamer in the sea of IT. Yeah, then I thought it might be really confusing. So I'd like to share 3 metaphors with you today. The first is a metaphor of a pottery maker. Second, a metaphor of a private detective. And the third, of a Lego set instructions creator. Well, a pottery maker. What does making pottery has to do with writing documentation? Basically, what I'm relating this is doing research and gathering information. And you can get a lot of information while you're reading, you're talking to SMEs, to multiple people. And you can see this as a bunch of clay, bunch of mud, so the raw material. And then, when you're making pottery, you have a lot of clay, and you are shaping it. You are using just a part of it and reducing it in value. Maybe you do multiple pots, multiple stuff. You do 1, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. You did 10 of them, which means it's like writing iteratively, so writing multiple drafts. And then you decide, oh, this is the one that's the best. And that's the one you sold, or that's the one that you publish, that you actually use. So making pottery might have something to do with writing documentation. Second metaphor that I quite like is the metaphor of a private detective. Because sometimes you need to ask clever questions when you are in touch with people. And you also need to think of stuff that is not said. It's like, oh, well, SMEs, they have very often deep knowledge of the product, but sometimes they miss a very important piece of information that they take for granted. And that's when you come into action, like, okay, so let's try this. So what is it? What do I exactly need for do that? How does this actually work? What does the user need to know? And also, being a private detective, you are asking clever questions, setting priorities, so knowing who to ask is a part of it. Because sometimes there's this one person that you didn't think of, it might be the tester, for example. Testers very often have a very good knowledge of how the product actually works. Yet, so many technical writers never are in touch with testers. So knowing who to ask and what to ask, being a private investigator, might also be a part of being a technical writer. Third metaphor I quite like is Lego instructions creator. So, you know, when you open a Lego set, there are a bunch of bricks. Basically, you can do whatever you want with them. And if you have some experience, you can even build something amazing from scratch. On the other hand, there's also the manual, the instructions. And the instructions are a guide. They tell you, okay, if you take these steps, you achieve this result. What you can do, of course, is to build it and then modify it. You can take another Lego set, merge them. Or you can decide in the middle, okay, this is good enough. Now I want to do something totally crazy, totally different, experiment. But the instructions are there and are there to help you. And when there's software, this is the kind of information that we provide as technical writers. I hope you like some of the metaphors, still working on them. If you have your own, please tell me at the party. Thank you.
So this is more like an invitation to discuss the topic of translating content in, and documentation in non-XML languages like Markdown, ASCII, Docker, structured text, because we can see nowadays that more and more open documentation projects are moving away from those XML-based languages like DocBook, which has been industry standard for many years. And now, if you create a documentation project, you probably go with Markdown, RST, ADoc, whatever. And sometimes translators can feel like being second-class citizens in this change, this shift. So my question really is like, what's the infrastructure you are using in terms of translatability? What's the tool you are using to convert content, ASCII-based content to translation files? What's the format of your translation files? And most importantly, what's your translation community experience if you are working with translators? And I expect many people in the audience here are working with translators, or they have translation team to work with. Maybe they are doing, some of you are translators yourself. So what's your experience in terms of usability, tools, processes, etc.? So yeah, if you are interested, meet me back there after the lightning talk block. I would love to share some ideas with you. Thank you.
Hi. So yeah, I've got a little bit of overlap with one of the previous speakers, but hopefully that's all right. So a lot of us here are tech writers. I'm a tech writer, and I think that's a really bad name for what we do. Like, firstly, technical, what does that mean? Like, a lot of things are technical, not just in software. You get technical legal content, so technical I'm not sure about. Writer I'm kind of not sure about either, because a lot of my time is not spent writing, researching, finding out stuff, structuring, planning. Actually, the writing takes up not that much time. And yeah, I'm aware of the irony as like writers that we should be able to find a good name for ourselves. So there are some other names that I kind of like, names that encompass the idea that we don't just write things like designer and editor. You get information engineers, you get knowledge architects. I quite like content designer, because I think that implies, not just working with words, there's all sorts of content. I also like the idea, again, you're designing words, you're not just designing content, not just writing them. There's also information experience. I think there are some people who have that job title. The idea UX, user experience, well, we do the information side of that, so we're information experience designers. Both of those names have kind of problems in that they don't have the instant recognition of, lots of people do know what tech writers are. So then it comes to the question of, okay, so what is a name for? Do we name ourselves to have an accurate label? Well, that's kind of nice. But actually, that's not the most useful part of a name. The most useful part of a name is what your users need to do with it. So are our users the people we interact with as colleagues, or people who we're looking for jobs, for example, the name that helps them understand what we do. And I think one of the reasons that technical writer finding a better name is hard is because it's vague. When things are difficult to name, it's often because they're badly defined. And because we do so many different things, maybe it's just difficult to find the right name because of that. And actually maybe having a vague name is useful because it gives people the, if your name gives people the right impression, they know roughly what work you do and what to come to you for. But you don't pin it down so it doesn't stop you doing things that don't technically fit into your job title. So much as I dislike the name tech writer, I think it's useful because it's vague and it's useful because it's recognizable. So ultimately, I haven't managed to solve my own problem, but if anyone's got any better ideas for what we should call ourselves, that would be great. I should say documentarian is great, but lots of us don't just write documentation either. So, yeah.
I talked about AI docs, and we'll do the unconference session in a few moments. Another topic that I'm really excited and interested in is API documentation, and more specifically, developer portals. So if you're anyhow working on developer portals, no matter how, if that's static files or in some kind of CMS, maybe in Drupal or Django or whatever, I'll put up another unconference session. Don't know yet when exactly. But if you bump into me and that's your thing, just come and talk to me about it. But because I want to find out if there's maybe a way to build a better tool for that. Because developer portals are this weird thing because they're documentation, but they're also kind of like a marketing tool because they needed to promote your API, and it's like on that interface of things that makes it interesting and difficult to do, because a lot of developer portals are just like a dumping ground of HTML.
So one of these days I'll actually get up on stage and give a talk, but organizing a conference and giving a talk is a sure way to, as Eric said, be very, very stressed out. But anyway, every other talk I give, I start with a why you should write documentation. Mostly this is for developers. It's also basically ammunition to give you the words to use to explain to other people why documentation is important, because presumably you already believe this. Number one, this is for programmers, remember. So as a programmer, sometimes you see bugs in code, and you're like, oh, where did this come from? I want to see what commit it was in, kind of how that happened, and you run a git blame on the code. And as a developer, oftentimes you do this, and you go, git blame, not me, not me, not me, not me. Because after 6 months, you don't know if the code that you wrote or the code someone else wrote, it is all the same. The information leaves your brain, and writing documentation, the best way I describe this to developers is it's like serializing the state of your brain into a format that other developers can load it back into their brain in the most efficient way possible. It is JSON for mental state around writing software. That is what documentation is in terms of developer documentation. Documentation is also marketing, right? Open source libraries, internal libraries. Who goes to GitHub and sees a repository with no README and decides, I'm gonna use that code? That's not me, and I sure as hell don't want to work with that person. So documentation is the most important form of marketing, whether you're at a large company and you're trying to sell the tools you write to other internal teams, whether you're building open source projects, onboarding people into the tools, installing it, having a good tutorial, all this stuff is incredibly important for actually having the code that you write be used by other humans, which is one of the most fundamental joys of writing software. Documentation-driven development also makes your code better. By writing a README, writing the public API of the code that you're about to write before you actually implement the code makes a profound difference in the actual end result of the code. Right? You can write a README, think through the implementation and how that gets exposed to users without having to write any code. Right? It's a lot easier to throw away a few lines of a README than a week's worth of work. And a lot of developers, when they go to solve a problem, they'll dive into it. And the way that a lot of developers understand problems is through implementing code. But at the end of that, you end up with code that shows all of the misturns and awful things that you learned along the way. And if you think about your public API before the code that you write, that will kind of save you from making the wrong mistakes and exposing that to your users through the API that you develop. And the last one, you want to be a better writer. I have a half-written blog post with a very provocative title of the most important skill that you can develop as a software engineer is being able to write, comma, words. So much of writing software is writing the correct software, right? All the product people in the room will tell you if you write the wrong thing, it doesn't matter how good, how efficient, how kind of useful it is if you're solving the wrong problem. Working in a team as a software engineer in an open source community in a company, you have to be able to communicate with your team members, with your product people, with your marketing people, with your entire organization. And as more and more of us get distributed, more and more work is done over email, over Slack, over mailing lists, writing is a fundamental skill, and communicating with other people as a technical person is the #1 fundamental skill that developers have as they build real products in the world. This is not just within the company, though. It's writing good comments, writing good documentation, writing good commit messages. Like, all of our job is writing words. Everything we put into Git is a written word in some form, whether it's a variable name or a code comment, right? Like, being able to communicate clearly with the written word is the most fundamental part of being a developer on the internet today. And there's a bunch more to this talk, and you can find it online. But anyway, I'll save my anti-markdown screed for later, but thank you for listening.
I wasn't planning on this, but then you would just wander around and have lots of free time. We don't want this to happen, so. I just wanted to check if anyone in the room is working on the software, documenting the software that has been developed for, I don't know, a decade or so, and you just have to kind of deal with it. Okay. Sounds like then maybe we can have a good session on Unconference on how to survive that, being a technical writer, and discuss your hacks or whatever, and maybe we can learn something from each other. So I will then post something on that board, and we can have a session of Unconference later today. Thanks.